Student debt can be crippling and demoralizing. At CBTS, we aim to see every student graduate debt-free.
CBTS students can prepare for ministry without taking on student debt or placing financial strain on their families.
As a husband and father, finances are always a concern, but it is a huge blessing to know that one day I'm going to graduate CBTS debt-free.
Welcome to another episode of the Covenant Podcast brought to you by Covenant Baptist Theological Seminary. This is a resource which exists to equip listeners with theological content from a 1689 Baptist perspective. My name is Austin McCormick. I'm one of the pastors of Covenant Baptist Church in Clarksville, Tennessee. I have with me my trusted co-host, soon to be Dr. Dovell, Dr. Dewey Dovell, one of the pastors of Emmanuel Reformed Baptist Church in SeaTac, Washington. And today we have the special privilege to welcome our new friend, Steve Kim, to the podcast for the first time. Welcome to the podcast, Steve.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, we're excited to have you on today. The topic of our conversation is the historicity of Christ's resurrection. Everybody can see that by the title of this episode. Clicking on the episode, obviously, they beat me to my announcing the title of the episode by already seeing what it is on their podcast feed. But Brother Steve, it is our tradition on this show that whenever we have someone on for the first time, we just begin by asking them to introduce themselves to our audience. So can you spend some time sharing whatever you want to about yourself so that way our audience can know you better for the purpose of this conversation?
I guess the most important thing that your listeners should know about me is that I am an undeservedly adopted son of God Most High, who saw in his good pleasure not only to forgive this rebel who committed high treason against the King of Kings, because I can understand why a king might offer clemency to a rebel. But then what blows my mind is that this king then turned around, took that extra step and said, you can be part of my family. I'm going to adopt you as my son. So this is nothing that I deserve, not one bit. It is a sheer act of grace on God's part. So that is all of that because of what Jesus Christ has done on the cross, which we'll talk about today. But that is what forms the core of my identity. That's where I start. That is who I am. I'm also a husband to one, father to two. I've been married to my wife, Sharina, for the last 15 years, and it's still, by the grace of God, it's still going strong. We have two kids, an 11-year-old daughter named Maya and a 9-year-old son named Tavin, and we live in the Edmonton area in the province of Alberta up here in Canada, where we frequently, especially in January, hit minus 40. And I believe minus 40 is where Fahrenheit and Celsius meet. And so ain't nobody got time for that, but that's where we live. That's what families here. So that's what draws us here. And then I guess the next most important thing is that I also happen to serve as the Alberta Director for Apologetics Canada Ministries, which is a national apologetics organization up here in Canada. We have people from coast to coast serving the kingdom, and our mission is to equip the Christian community with a biblically sound, intellectually robust, and culturally engaged faith. And that's a little bit about who I am.
Well, Steve, we are so thankful to have you on the show today. We're immensely grateful for the work that you brothers and sisters are doing up north in Canada, and so thankful for your willingness to defend the faith and to show both believers and unbelievers alike the cultural relevance and the timeless relevance of these truths that we hold fast to as followers of Jesus Christ. And today we're talking about really what's at the very heart and soul of Christianity, the historicity of Christ's resurrection. And maybe just to get our conversation started, in your experience, your research, your education, your interests on this subject, maybe walk our listeners through some of the steps that historians might take or scholars might take in thinking through the historicity of a particular event, and
Mhm.
how that maybe grounds differing levels of certainty. In other words,
Mhm.
based on a historical study of a particular event or person, how does a historian or a scholar dictate the level of certainty regarding any details related to those sorts of things?
Yeah, so that's a wonderful question, because that sets really the tone for everything else we're going to talk about. So I really appreciate the question. I guess historiography is a pretty broad area, and even in different pockets of this discipline of history, different historians will do things a little differently. And so you'll find classicists doing things a little bit different than even from New Testament scholars. So, because we're talking about the resurrection of Jesus, let me just focus in on the historical Jesus studies side of things in the New Testament studies. So, New Testament scholars generally not everybody accepts these criteria, but they generally do go by this criteria called the criteria of authenticity. So there are a number of criteria that a New Testament historian will take a historical piece or historical datum and put it through this criteria and see if it passes. So there are several of them. One is called the criterion of multiple attestation. So if there is a piece of historical datum that is in not just one source, but in multiple independent sources, then it gives that datum a little bit more of the sense of authenticity. It's a little bit more likely now that this thing actually happened. So an example of that would be Jesus's feeding of the 5,000. Now that is found in all four gospels, including John, which is pretty rare. Of all the things that Jesus has done in his life on his earthly in his earthly ministry, you see a lot of the same material in Matthew, Mark, Luke. But then this one in particular, you also see it recorded in the Gospel of John. And so when you look at something like that, okay, well, this is not found in just one historical source. There's an independent source that also talks about it. So now it moves the needle a little bit more to the authentic side of things, so to speak. Another criterion might be this is probably my favorite, is the criterion of embarrassment. I say it's my favorite because it's so easy to understand. And so if there is an element of embarrassment for the early church, now the early church is recording the life of Jesus, and so if there's a detail in there that would have been embarrassing to the early church, it's probably, again, it moves the needle a little bit more to the authentic side. So one example of that is Peter's denial of Jesus. Now, for those of us who are familiar with the gospel accounts, we know that Peter, you could almost see him as sort of the head of the disciples. He was the one who proclaimed Jesus to be the Messiah. He's the one who to whom Jesus said, "On this rock, I'm going to build my church." So he's a pretty important figure. And yet here he is denying Jesus 3 times. I don't know this man. Now, Jesus is arrested. It is clear, this, at least clear in Peter's eyes as a mere mortal, this messianic movement is failing. And so he wants to distance himself from Jesus. And so he denies him 3 times. I don't know the man. I have nothing to do with him. Hey, you've got a Galilean accent. I'm pretty sure I saw you with this man Jesus. And Peter denies him, even calling a curse down upon himself. He denies Jesus 3 times. Now, you got to look at it from the perspective of the early church. That's a pretty embarrassing piece of information to include. So if the early church included this in the gospel accounts, then it's more likely now that this story is actually authentic. And there are lots of others too, like the criterion of dissimilarity, where if there is a piece of information in the gospel accounts or in the New Testament in general that is so unlike what the Jews actually believed in the life of the early church, that's probably more likely to be an authentic piece of information. So an example of that might be if you read the Gospels, especially, I mean, not just in Mark, but this does stand out to me in the Gospel of Mark, where Jesus doesn't want his followers to openly talk about his messiahship until much later in his ministry. So at the beginning, he constantly tells his disciples, don't talk about me being the Messiah. He heals somebody and says, just go tell your friends and family what the Lord has done for you, but don't openly talk about this. But of course, we read about people being healed and then talking about Jesus is the Lord. And so then Jesus can't enter towns openly, those kinds of things. Now, again, think of it from the perspective of the early church. What is the early church doing? They're proclaiming openly. I mean, that's the message, right? Jesus is the Messiah. He's the savior of the world. And yet they record Jesus as being rather secretive about his messiahship. And so that's a little bit different from what you would expect from the early church or early Jewish beliefs and so on. And there are other things as well. That's just an example. Anyway, all that to say, these are just 3 examples of the criteria of authenticity. There are others as well, but hopefully that gives you enough to get the sense that, okay, when historians come to a text and they start assessing the authenticity of a historical datum, there are certain rules to go about things. It's not that they just kind of do this willy-nilly.
That's helpful as an overview to determine an event's historicity. So thank you for that explanation. Can you now transition into explaining how those procedures might be applied to evaluating the biblical claim that Jesus rose from the dead?
Mm-hmm.
In your experience, what are the best historical arguments for the resurrection of Jesus, and what tend to be the most common historical arguments against resurrection?
Yeah, so when we are thinking about establishing some kind of a historical event, it's actually very similar to how we do court proceedings, say, for a criminal case. Because in a criminal case, what you're doing is you're trying to reconstruct the past to see whether this defendant is, whether the accused is actually guilty or not. And so there are some similarities there. And so when you come to this issue of this alleged historical event that God raised Jesus from the grave, from the dead, which, by the way, is the very cornerstone of the entire Christian faith. In fact, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, if Jesus is not raised from the dead, I'm just paraphrasing here, you can sleep in on Sunday. Don't bother, right? We're still in our sins. We are of all men most to be pitied. And so, which, by the way, just as an aside, which is rather odd when you think about it in terms of world religions. So I remember when I was doing my studies in Christian apologetics, the head of the program, Dr. Craig Hazen, he has his PhD in religious studies. So he studied many different world religions. And one of the things that he mentioned that I remember very clearly is, if you were to just completely make up a religion, you don't do it with some kind of an objectively verifiable historical event. You don't base it on that. You want to appeal to something that's hard to verify, some kind of an internal experience, whether it's a revelation that you allegedly received from an angel, or it's some kind of an inner insight, like you do these meditations to see the truth about the world, something internal. But Christianity is a little bit bizarre. It doesn't quite fit in the box neatly, in the sense that the whole religion sits on this alleged historical event called the resurrection of Jesus. So this is a really key event that, without this, Christianity just doesn't stand. Now, having said that, historical investigation is really a 2-step process. The first thing, a lot like a criminal investigation, the first step is to gather evidence. And then the second step is coming up with some kind of an explanation that accounts for all of the evidence appropriately. And so what are some, where do we get this historical evidence from? We get that from the New Testament accounts. We get that from extra biblical sources that talks about Jesus, for example, like Josephus, for example. So you collect the data and then you try to actually explain what is going on. So there are, I guess I should also set the stage, because our listeners who are a little bit more inclined to be skeptical might think, well, so you're saying Jesus rose from the dead because the Bible says so. Not quite like that, because when historians come to the New Testament, they don't come to the New Testament, because you have to remember that even though as Christians, you and I might believe this is more than mere human historical documents that were circulating independently, 27 different books and letters, it's certainly no less than that, right? These are, in his providence, God put the New Testament together through the human writers. So we believe it's more than mere human documents, but it's no less than human documents. And so when historians, believers or not, when they approach the New Testament documents, they look at it as human documents from antiquity. And so it's not as simple as, okay, well, Jesus rose from the dead because the Bible says so. But historians generally agree that the four Gospels in particular are the best sources of Jesus' life that we have. So we use those. And there are certain key details that you can pull from that surrounding the resurrection. So coming then back to the criteria that we talked about, for example, one historical datum is that Jesus actually died by Roman crucifixion in year 30 or 33 AD, somewhere around there. Those two are the most prominent dates, either year 30 or 33 AD, one of those. Under Pontius Pilate, he was crucified, Jesus died. That is multiply attested. You don't just find it in one account. In fact, you even find that in extra biblical sources like Josephus. So this is well attested, multiple independent attestation. So that's good. Another piece might be the burial of Jesus. Joseph of Arimathea, who was one of the members of the Jewish council, it is recorded that he's the one who took Jesus's body and buried him. Again, this checks multiple attestation, because you see that in Matthew and you also see that recorded in John. But this one also, you could argue that this one also passes the criterion of embarrassment. Why is that? Well, again, from the perspective of the early church, you have to look at, who is this Joseph of Arimathea? Well, he, like I said earlier, he was a member of the Sanhedrin, the Jewish council. Now, who are the Sanhedrin? What did they do? In the eyes of the early church, these are the guys who engineered deicide. These are the guys, excuse me, these are the ones who got Jesus arrested and handed him over to the Romans to be crucified. So to have a member of that group give Jesus the honorable burial, there is some embarrassment there. So because that is included, that burial, then the needle moves a little bit more to the authentic side of things. And then you also see that what is recorded in the Gospels is that Jesus's women followers discovered the tomb empty the following Sunday. Why is this significant? Because, again, this is a criterion of embarrassment. Back in the day, nothing against viewers and listeners who are women, nothing against you ladies, but back in the day, women's testimonies were not considered valid in the court of law. And so to have women be the discoverers of the tomb, there's some embarrassment there for the early church. Now, again, you have to look at it from the perspective of the early church. If they were completely fabricating this account about Jesus rising from the dead, this is probably how you would want to go about it. This is actually counterproductive to have women be the first discoverers of the tomb. And yet that's exactly what's recorded. And so you can even tell that from 1 Corinthians 15, which would have been written around mid-50s by Paul. Now, I'm sure there are other scholars who can argue with me on the exact dating of the letter, but for the sake of the argument, let's say mid-50s, Paul wrote 1 Corinthians chapter 15 of that letter. Paul talks about how he is passing on to the Corinthian church what he also received. And then he says a bunch of things that historians generally accept as an early hymn or an early creed of the Christian faith. So let me just pull that up here. 1 Corinthians 15. I'm just reading this from the ESV. And this is what it says. Now I would remind you, brothers, of the gospel I preached to you, which you received, in which you stand, and by which you are being saved, if you hold fast to the word I preached to you, unless you believed in vain. Now listen to this. For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Now, what you don't see mentioned in there are the women who discovered the tomb. It goes from the burial, and then, it goes from being raised, and then it goes straight to appearances to Peter or Cephas and to the 12. It goes right to men. If you look at the gospel accounts, just how prominent the women's role is in the discovery of the tomb, it's a little bit odd that that's missing already in 1 Corinthians 15. And later, if you look at later forgeries like the Gospel of Peter. Now, if you've never heard of the Gospel of Peter, it's a really fun read. You can go look it up. It's a later forgery. It was not something that Peter wrote. I believe it is dated to middle of the 2nd century and maybe even a little later. So this is well past the time that Peter would have been alive. So this is a passion account. This is the account of Jesus' death and resurrection. And if you actually read that, what's really funny is when the tomb opens up, all the men are there. Now we may be familiar with the account in Matthew where the 2 Roman guards are placed at the tomb. But if you read the Gospel of Peter, it's not just 2 soldiers. There are more soldiers that are keeping watch 2 by 2 throughout the night, and the Jewish elders are also there. And then the tomb opens and everybody sees Jesus coming out of the tomb, followed by a walking, talking cross. and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But those are the first witnesses, and the women come into the picture only after. But in the gospel accounts, women are the discoverers of the tomb, who then tell other disciples, the male disciples, that they saw the tomb open. So again, this is a bit embarrassing, kind of a detail, that if the early church, again, if they were completely fabricating this story, they probably wouldn't have done it this way. And then another historical datum you could say is Jesus' appearance to the disciples. Now, you could even argue that, okay, let's just even say that it wasn't Jesus. But the disciples certainly thought and believed that what they saw was Jesus. you could even stop there and still make the case. I certainly do believe that it was Jesus, and the gospel writers all record that it was Jesus. And then lastly, I mean, there's way more than just these 5, but I'm just giving you a sample. Another historical datum that you could talk about is the fact that the disciples were ready and willing to go to their deaths, defending the message that God raised Jesus from the dead. These scared disciples who were locked up in the upper room after Jesus died because they were afraid of what their fellow Jews might do to them. Somehow something happened to them that they were completely transformed, and they were willing to go to their deaths defending that message that Jesus was raised from the dead. Now, here are some historical data, and so let's say this is the first step. Now the second step is you got to come up with an explanation. What kind of an explanation will this be? Because at the end of the day, what you have is this. The disciples spent time with Jesus. They saw him alive. They saw him die by Roman hands. And then they saw him alive after. So you have to come up with some kind of an explanation for this. Were they lying? Because that was the earliest accusation against the disciples, first disciples, was that, well, they must have stolen the body and they lied about it. So were they lying about it? I don't think that's likely, because why would you die for a lie? Something that you know to be a lie, right? Now, some people might say, yeah, Steve, but you have, in radical Islam, you have suicide bombers. They're willing to die for what they believe is true. But what's different about the disciples is that they were in the place to know if they had in fact stolen the body, hidden it away, and proclaimed Jesus to be alive, then, man, like you know what you're saying is a lie. Would you really be willing to die for what you know is a lie? Not what you believe to be true, right? But what you are actually in the place, you know what it is that you've done. You stole the body. You know this is a lie. Are you willing to really give up all that you have? Or wouldn't it be much easier rather for you to just come clean and say, yeah, that was a complete lie. Those other guys, they're all lying too. I know where we placed the body. You can go look that up. I mean, that would have been much easier. It would have been a lot more expedient for preserving your life than making this very uncomfortable proclamation that God raised Jesus from the dead, which alienated the disciples. Mind you, they were all, early disciples were all Jewish. That would have alienated them from their fellow Jews, their family and friends, and the Jewish leaders certainly didn't like this. The Roman authorities wanted to quash the early church movement. I mean, it's just, they had to give up everything to make this claim. So how likely is it that they were lying about it? And how do you explain the fact that if Jesus, according to this explanation, Jesus still remains dead, then what was it that the disciples thought they saw? Because he should be dead. There shouldn't be any sightings, but the sightings were reported. In fact, it's not just mere sightings. They spent 40 days eating, drinking, walking, and talking with who they thought was Jesus. Now, some people might say that, okay, maybe they didn't steal the body. Maybe that explanation doesn't work. Maybe they were hallucinating. Now, Luke tells us at the beginning of the book of Acts, so for those listeners who are maybe perhaps not familiar with the New Testament, Luke was the person who wrote the Gospel of Luke, the third book in the New Testament. And as a follow-up, he wrote a second volume called the Book of Acts. So these two are actually supposed to go together. And at the beginning of the book of Acts, Luke actually talks about his previous volume, referring to the Gospel according to Luke. And in the book of Acts, he refers to it and says, so I told you, O Theophilus, because that's who he's writing to, of all the things that Jesus began to do and teach. And then he talks about how Jesus spent 40 days with the disciples after his resurrection. And so again, if this is just a hallucination event, then that's quite the hallucination. Not to mention that it's not just one person, but it's a mass of people. And not to mention that this hallucination was very polymodal. And what I mean by that is this: when you have a hallucination, I'm not an expert in this area, but what I hear is when you have a hallucination, usually it involves one of your senses. You perhaps see what isn't there, very briefly, mind you, and that's I've had that happen to me. Very uncomfortable, by the way. Or you think you hear something that's not actually there, or you think you felt something on your skin, but there's nothing there. Whatever it is, it generally involves just one sense. What you see in the gospel narrative, even if you were to take it as a hallucination, you have people are eating, walking, talking with Jesus for 40 days. And not just one person, but many people. So that hallucination explanation becomes less and less plausible because of that. And again, would this hallucination have been strong enough then to change the lives of the disciples completely to the point where they're willing to die for what they believe is true? And here's the kicker too. According to this theory, okay, Jesus was crucified, he died, he's buried, and the disciples are hallucinating. Where is Jesus's body then? It would have been in the tomb. So if the Roman authorities and the Jewish authorities, if they wanted to quash the early church movement, then all they had to do was just go to the tomb and produce the body of Jesus, and that would have been game over for the early church. But that's not what happened. And then to add to that, here is a datum that I didn't talk about. But where did the church begin? It didn't start in Rome, didn't start in Antioch, it didn't start in Alexandria. It started right there in Jerusalem, where these events supposedly happened. So it's one thing if the church starts in Rome and they're talking about events that happened in Jerusalem. It's far enough away that if you really wanted to fabricate stories, you might be able to get away with it. But then to come up with these stories of a dead man coming back to life, leaving an empty tomb behind, and then starting a church right there where people can actually go and investigate, that's very unlikely, right? So, and that has been the message right from the get-go by the church, is that God raised Jesus from the dead. God raised Jesus from the dead. And the church started in Jerusalem, right where these things supposedly happened. If Jesus, in fact, remained dead and remained in the tomb, all that the Jewish authorities and the Roman authorities had to do was just produce the body, and that would have been game over. So the hallucination explanation doesn't seem to fit. And there are lots of other explanations like this. But if you put the story, sorry, I shouldn't say the story. If you posit the resurrection, let's take that explanation and run it from the beginning to the end. It just fits everything, as far as I'm concerned. And so, as a matter of historical probability judgment, it seems to me that the resurrection, that really stands out to me. It seems to explain the evidence quite well. Now, before we move on, if I may bring in just one more. Now, I mentioned earlier the disciples who were willing to die. This is my favorite piece of evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, is James, the brother of Jesus, the half-brother of Jesus. Now, do you have brothers by any chance? Yeah?
I have a younger brother.
You have a younger brother?
Yeah, I have a half younger brother.
Okay, so let's think of it this way. Let's say your brother came to you and said, Well, like, I don't know how to tell you this, but I'm the Messiah. I'm the Lord of the universe. I'm the King of Kings, and I am the Good Shepherd, and I am the one through whom the God will save the world, right? If your brother came to you and said that to you, what would be your reaction to that?
Well, I'm already laughing, so that kind of gives away
Yeah,
my answer to that question.
right. Now, I have an older brother too, so I sometimes imagine, like, vividly imagine my brother Peter coming to me and telling me this. I mean, I'm just like, okay, I know you, I grew up with you, and I think what you need to do is get some help. Like, you don't come and talk to me. Go get some professional help. What does it take for a brother to believe that his older half brother is the Messiah, the Lord of the universe, King of Kings, Alpha and the Omega? Like, what does it take? And yet, here's the brother, half brother of Jesus, James, who became became a leader in the early church, especially in Jerusalem, and he eventually died. In fact, Josephus records it in his book Antiquities of the Jews, where he kind of lays out the history of the Jewish people up to that point. Now, Josephus writing probably towards the end of the first century, so he's not too far removed from the time of Jesus. And he actually records James, the brother of Jesus, being stoned to death. Now, he doesn't mention very specifically whether James was killed for his belief that his brother is the Messiah, but he did die being stoned to death. And Josephus records it very specifically, James, the brother of the so-called Christ. And so Josephus connects James very specifically to Jesus, which would have been a little bit strange because generally you are identified by your relationship to your father, right? So Jesus, the son of Mary, or Jesus, the son of Joseph, or John, the son of Zechariah, those kinds of things. But here's Josephus identifying. Josephus was a Jew, by the way, right? And here he is identifying James as the brother of Jesus, the so-called Christ. And so we know that he died. We know that he was an early leader in the Jerusalem church. And here he is dying as a leader of the church, which was proclaiming that Jesus is the Messiah, whom God raised from the dead. And so what does it take for a brother to believe that his own brother is that? It's got to take something pretty amazing. So I'm not saying that my view of the resurrection rests all on that piece of evidence, but it's a line of evidence, right? When you pull all the pieces together, you have to come up with an explanation. And it seems to me the resurrection provides the best explanation for all of this. And of course, you also, that means whatever it is that Jesus said in his life, now we have grounds to take it way more seriously. Because I tend to take more seriously the words of somebody who came back from the dead.
Very well said, brother. And thank you for walking us through all those different lines of historical evidence and even walking through those common objections to the resurrection of Jesus. I think just watching you do this, and when I've listened to other people give historical arguments, or I've read books that pertain to the historicity of Christ's resurrection, I'm always impressed. And I'm also, as a pastor, and really as somebody who's not done the scholarly work that many have done in this field, I sit back and wonder sometimes, like, is it possible for the average layperson to engage in the same kind of argumentation that you've just engaged with, or that authors or other scholars may engage with, whether it be in books or in podcast forums and those sorts of things. So I think practically speaking, knowing our audience is likely people who probably 95 to 98% are not going to specialize in historiography, or they're not going to be seasoned evidentialists when it comes to providing maybe an apologetical defense for the resurrection of Christ, or engaging with historical arguments against the resurrection. This isn't going to be in their wheelhouse, so to speak. So I wonder if you can give some encouragement to our listeners who fit that wide swath, that big category, and just encourage them how they can be better equipped to give a defense of Christ's resurrection. I mean, obviously, Scripture should be our ultimate authority. That's where we start. We recognize that God is sovereign in salvation, so that faith is even a gift of His grace. But nevertheless, part of the means that God can use to draw an unbeliever to faith is by knowing compelling arguments for the truthfulness of things like Christ's resurrection. So how would you encourage, just to tie all that up, I know I'm throwing a lot at you, how would we encourage the layperson or even the pastor who's not an expert, not a scholar on historical lines of evidence, but still maybe could grow in this area? What encouragement would you give to people of that nature?
Yeah, that's a really important question, because as an organization that is engaged in apologetics, we take not First Corinthians. I keep going to that because that's what I was talking about. 1 Peter 3:15, where Peter says, "In your heart, set apart Christ as Lord, and always be ready to give an answer to anyone who asks you for the reason for the hope that is in you, but do it with gentleness and respect." Now, when I look at that imperative, that command isn't for specialists. That is for the whole church. So we have a ministry friend, J. Warner Wallace, who, by the way, came to know the Lord through his work as a cold case homicide detective. Remember what I said earlier, that historical investigation has a lot in common with criminal investigation? So he would be a case in point. So something that he said really resonated with me all those years ago. He said this, that what we need is not just one $50 million apologist. What we need is 50 million $1 apologists. So the command to give a reason for the hope that is in us isn't just for specialists, it's for all of us. Everybody is an apologist, whether you like it or not. The question is whether you're a good one or a bad one. And quite frankly, you don't need to be a rock star in apologetics. So maybe this will be an encouragement to people. I consider myself to be a very normal guy in this regard. I mean, I work with my colleague Wesley Huff. Those listeners and viewers might recognize that name. He was on Joe Rogan podcast a few months ago, and he got a lot of exposure through that. I work with him, and he is a bona fide historian. He is doing his PhD at the University of Toronto. That's his wheelhouse. So the difference in technical knowledge is just, I mean, he's a bona fide historian. I'm not. I am an average Christian, a very normal guy who, by the way, if this, I don't know, this may resonate with some people, maybe not, but I'm just a very normal person in the sense that one of my guilty pleasures is eating instant ramen noodles late at night and watching YouTube videos on North Korea. Like, what is Kim Jong-un up to this time? I'm just a normal guy. I had to start from somewhere, and I consider myself to be somewhat studied in this area. And if I can make a case for the resurrection like this, anybody can. Now, you might be a little bit overwhelmed in terms of, well, where do I start? Because there's so much written out there. And my encouragement to you is start somewhere. Don't think about where you want to be 5 years down the road. Think about the next thing you can do, like right next minute. If I were to, get a book and start going through it, or find a podcast and start listening through it, where would I start? And my next encouragement is, as you get started, give yourself lots of grace, because you're going to run into a lot of terms, or you're entering into a universe of discourse, if you will, where you're just kind of getting the lay of the land, and you're going to stumble along for a while before you start to see the lay of the land, and you start to see, okay, these are the kinds of arguments that are being raised, arguments and counter arguments. Here are some questions about historical methodologies and those kinds of things. And so give yourself lots of grace. And thirdly, what I would say is, if you find yourself disheartened, I would have to actually psychologize a little bit and ask why. Why do you feel disheartened that you can't make a case like this? Now, I just want to address this issue quickly, because I think I was a case in point. I had in my mind, I always had a picture of me sitting down across the table with a skeptic and making this case, and he's asking all these like really difficult historical questions about the historicity of the resurrection, and what if I can't make a case? What if I fail to convert this guy? And in fact, what happens if I get so convinced by his argument and I lose my faith, or something like that, right? So I have to wonder, like, why was I so disheartened? It's because I had that in my mind. Because somehow in doing that, I had taken that person's salvation on my shoulders, and somehow I had taken my own salvation and put it on my own shoulders, as if that I had to somehow maintain this faith. So what I want to encourage our listeners and viewers to do is maybe take a moment and think about, if you feel overwhelmed by this, why is that? Do you have that picture in your mind? Have you perhaps unwittingly taken on that person's salvation on your shoulders? Because I agree with you, Dewey and Austin. I think you would agree with me when I say that salvation is the work of the Holy Spirit. It's not the work of Steve Kim, right? It's not the work of Dewey and Austin, and it's not the work of the average Joe in the pew. So keeping that in mind, we just play our small part. And so give yourself lots of grace. Start small. With that said, I would like to recommend maybe a few resources to get you started. Now, this might seem a little strange to some people, but maybe not. What I would recommend people to do is, before you get to the resurrection, it's really helpful to actually first, in your mind, establish the reliability of Scripture, especially the New Testament. So what I would recommend is something like Peter J. Williams's book, Can We Trust the Gospels? That's a really handy book. It's not too terribly long. It's not too academic, so you should be able to go through that. And again, if this is a very new area to you, give yourself lots of time as you go through this book and look up terms and so on. But on the whole, it's not too technical. So it's a really great book to go through. And another book that I've really enjoyed reading is called Hidden in Plain View by Lydia McGrew. Now, there are a few other books out there by that title, so just make sure that the author is Lydia McGrew, Hidden in Plain View. And what this book does, it establishes the reliability of the New Testament by showing how little accidental details in different accounts seem to fit like a puzzle. And so that actually gives you a greater confidence that this is actually what I'm reading is reliable historical stuff. Let me just give our listeners just a flavor of that. Just one quick example of that is the feeding of the 5,000. I mentioned this a number of times. If you go to John 6:5 through 7, it says, lifting up his eyes then, and seeing that a large crowd was coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat? Now, notice who Jesus is talking to. Jesus is talking to Philip. Now, that's a little odd in the sense that Philip is a relatively minor figure in the Gospels. It would have made sense for Jesus to talk to maybe Peter, James, and John, who were sort of the inner circle, inner three, but he's talking to Philip instead. maybe would have even made sense for Jesus to talk to Judas, because John tells us that he was the one who was handling money. And yet he's talking to Philip. Why is that? Well, if you go to Luke chapter 9, verse 10 and 11, it says that this was happening near Bethsaida. So then you go back to the Gospel of John, not to chapter 6, but right at the beginning, chapter 1, verse 44, it tells us that Philip was from Bethsaida. So here are small details that fit together like a puzzle piece. John 6 tells us Jesus talking to Philip. Luke 9, 10, and 11 give us the location where the feeding is happening. And then in an independent material in John 1, 44, Philip's origin is told to us. So the book Hidden in Plain View are filled with insights like that, that I think our listeners might find really helpful. So I would start there. Certainly, I would be remiss not to mention my colleague Wes's website, wesleyhuff.com. He's what I find a lot of people find it really helpful when they discover his infographics. So just go to his website, wesleyhuff.com, look up his infographics. There are lots of slides that you will find really, really beneficial and helpful. And of course, we have our own resource as well. Can I Trust the Bible? You can find it on YouTube. So look up Apologetics Canada, Can I Trust the Bible? There's a whole playlist. We have episode 1 and 2. We have episodes 3 and 4 that are coming in the next a little while here. And so those are some resources that I would want everyone to at least get started on, and then move into the resurrection more specifically later down the road.
Steve, this has been a joy talking with you about such an important subject, and I trust that our listeners will be encouraged just by your humility and your heartfelt appeals that you've given for them to grow in their knowledge of the scriptures and to progressively grow in their ability to think through the historical arguments that can be made. And I love how you pointed us back to the Spirit's role in salvation. And when we recognize that salvation is of the Lord, that takes the burden off of our shoulders, and we can rest knowing that God uses our feeble efforts to accomplish his purposes and to bring about the salvation of his people in his timing and in his ways. And we're very thankful for your willingness to remind us of that truth. As we look to close, I want to give you the last word. Are there any exciting events or updates with Apologetics Canada that you'd like to let our listeners know? I know you've given us some resources to chew on, which is how we normally ask our interviewees to conclude our discussion. So if there's anything about just your ministry or the collective ministry of Apologetics Canada that you want to share, please feel free to do so, and then we'll draw our time together to a close.
Yeah, no, thank you, Dewey and Austin, for inviting me here. Thank you, brothers, for giving me a hearing. This has been an absolute honor and pleasure and joy to be here with you to talk about what I think is the most important question in the world, which is, did Jesus rise from the dead? So thank you for that wonderful privilege. If your listeners want to find out more about what it is that we do, you can always go to apologeticscanada.com, apologeticscanada.com. We do have our annual flagship conferences happening, one in the Vancouver area in March and another one in Ontario, usually in the fall. So there is also an event coming this fall called Can I Trust the Bible? That's happening in Toronto. I know probably most of your listeners are tuning in from the United States, but if you happen to be close by, or if you happen to be willing to fly out for some of these events, by all means, go to our website, apologeticscanada.com, and you can learn more about that.
I do believe we have some Canadian students.
I should mention one more thing. Sorry to interrupt you.
You're good.
Yeah. So we have those events, but if you can't join us for these events, you can always tune into our weekly podcast called the AC Podcast. You can find us on all major streaming platforms. So you can go there and check out what it is that we're talking about.
Thank you, brother. Thank you for sharing that. And one last question. Go Oilers. I take it being in Edmonton.
Oh, yes. That's a
Okay.
very good question. So I am from BC. So I moved to the Edmonton area about 7 years ago because this is where my wife's side of the family is from. So I'm a Canucks guy at heart. But
Okay.
when my family moved here, I can tell you there was a veritable battle for the souls of our two children because my brother-in-law and his family, they cheer for the Edmonton Oilers. My parents-in-law, they are from Calgary, and so they cheer for Calgary Flames. And so all of a sudden, all this paraphernalia, Oilers and Flames paraphernalia came our way. So we have a house divided.
Right.
So my daughter tends to cheer for the Flames, and my son tends to cheer for the Oilers. And here I am rooting for the Canucks. So it's a bit of a complicated, divided house situation.
Brother, you're dealing with complicated issues with your apologetics work, so you can, I'm sure, steward those complexities with hockey divisions in your home. Thank you again, Steve, for taking the time to join us. To our listeners, as always, we thank you as well for your continued support of the Covenant Podcast. We just encourage you, if you were blessed by today's conversation and you're not already doing so, please feel free to subscribe to our YouTube channel. We have all of our other episodes provided at our Covenant Baptist Theological Seminary YouTube channel. We have other edifying resources as well that you can check out. Also want to encourage you, as our brother mentioned, to go check out Apologetics Canada resources as well. If you're blessed by today's conversation, I trust you would be further edified by going to their resources that you can find on social media and various other platforms. So thank you guys so much for tuning in. And until next time, we wish you grace and peace from the Covenant Podcast. God bless.